Project Zomboid is a permadeath roguelike in which you play as a survivor of the zombie apocalypse. It takes inspiration from George Romero's iconic zombie films, beginning with 1968's Night of the Living Dead, and also from best-selling novels by Max Brooks. At the 2012 Rezzed Gaming Conference, in a response to the question, "Why zombies?", developer Andy Hodgetts of development studio The Indie Stone responded,
Well, the thing is obviously anyone who's watched any zombie film ever has had exactly this idea. It's just everyone, it occurs to everybody. You know, everyone sits around and discusses their own plans for a zombie apocalypse, and probably is asked the question, why the hell doesn't that game exist? You know, and there are things like it, like Rogue Survivor and games like that, but none which are very authentic to the Romero Max Brooks zombies.
You can see these influences in everything from the design of the zombies themselves through to the music and sound design. It's certainly got a unique art style. These things are subjective, but it's fairly safe to say that it might not be for everyone. And it's still in flux. A comparatively recent shift to 3D character models represents a substantial change in art direction in and of itself. I've come to appreciate it, although there are aspects of it that bleed into game design in ways that are somewhat awkward. Despite having an isometric perspective, the environments are 2D, so there's no map rotation. Sometimes your character model can be obscured by scenery in ways that are unhelpful, but in my experience, not outright game-breaking. The original soundtrack is interesting and also wears its influences on its sleeve. Despite being broken up with periods of silence, repetition becomes an issue. The music also interferes with your ability to hear your adversaries. As your character's awareness is limited to a visual cone in the direction they're facing, audio cues are an important part of communicating danger to the player. I ended up switching the music off a couple of hours in. In any event, like all good zombie art, Project Zomboid knows that what's truly interesting about a zombie apocalypse isn't the zombies, but the survivors. The choices, sacrifices and mistakes they make while trying to scrape out another day, and the stories of how they fail. In the default scenario, you step into the shoes of a survivor in one of 4 starting locations, each part of the same large map, at the beginning of a zombie plague. From there, you have to handle the basics: water, food, shelter, wheels, while either dispatching or avoiding zombies. It's here you'll get your first taste of the core gameplay loops, either engaging in or avoiding combat, and looting. Combat seems simple at first. A single zombie in an open space in broad daylight isn't usually that dangerous. In the early game, you can rely on common household items to bludgeon the odd Zed as you move from house to house trying to secure the essentials. Something like a baseball bat has plenty of reach, allowing you to swat away in relative safety. You'll also quickly get the hang of basic sneaking, an essential tool for thinning out zombie populations as you're looting and, later, around your base. It won't take long for a Zed to get in close though. Perhaps they surprise you as you're moving from room to room or as you round the corner of a building. At close range, you want to give them a quick shove before swinging your weapon. If you get lucky, they might even fall over, giving you a moment to collect yourself. But what starts out simple reveals a surprising amount of challenge and complexity the more time you spend with it. The combat and sneaking mechanics in Project Zomboid are solid. It's in these systems, amongst others, that you can see the years of iteration that have gone into this game. Come up against 2 zombies and you quickly sense the heightened stakes. One will come at you, scratching and biting while you're trying to shove the other one away. Perhaps you'll realise then that by knocking one of them over and standing on its body, you can prevent it from getting up while you dispatch the other. But you're unlikely to come out of a melee encounter involving 3 zombies. Provided you're outdoors, you can try to kite them and then slip out of sight. In their lust for human flesh, they'll come flailing after you through windows, under furniture and cars. The first time you find a shotgun, you'll think you've got it made, but in fact guns are almost always a terrible idea for reasons that will quickly become apparent to you. You'll try to exploit the cover of darkness to sneak around, only to discover that you're effectively blind without a torch and precious batteries. Whispering or yelling can be used to your advantage, allowing you to surgically peel zombies off a horde for easy dispatch, or to draw them out of hiding in cramped quarters. Sound cues are essential. Moaning sounds are a dead giveaway, of course, but also more subtle and disturbing environmental sounds such as the squeak of rotting flesh against a window or the rhythmic droning of a head or limb banging against a door. Wear headphones if you can. Note that if you don't want to play the default scenario, there are also a number of unique survival scenarios to choose from. Some feature unique atmospheric events such as a storm or dense fog, and others draw inspiration from classic zombie and horror cinema tropes. One is an overt nod to another of Project Zomboid's influences, the classic roguelike Cataclysm: Dark Days Ahead. I played on both keyboard and mouse, and my comments apply regardless of input. For what it's worth, I found that mouse and keyboard were ultimately better than a controller, but that the controller input scheme is surprisingly good. One final note is that, owing to Project Zomboid's long development, you'll need to opt into the beta version to play a remotely up-to-date build. Currently that's build 41. Just right-click on the game in Steam and then select Properties, Beta to make the change. Choices and consequences are at the systemic heart of Project Zomboid. Plenty of games lean on branching story choices that are designed in advance by the developers. Do a thing and it will have this pre-written consequence. Some games explicitly give you good and evil conversation choices, for example. Some games are more subtle. But usually a player expects that this type of story-driven choice is in some way legible and fair. Choosing the good option should lead to the good outcome. Writers might choose to obscure the potential consequences of a story choice, but player expectations of fairness mean that there's usually quite a lot of telegraphing being done. What this ends up doing is collapsing the choice and the consequence of that choice. You're really choosing a consequence directly. In that sense, it's nothing like choice in the real world, where you're almost always acting with imperfect information and no foreknowledge of the actual consequences. Roguelikes handle choice and consequence in a far more interesting way, and Project Zomboid's real strength as a game is that its particular mix of scenario and systems gives rise to great stories. Players interact with the game's systems by playing, and those systems have direct and indirect consequences that give rise to emergent gameplay. In Project Zomboid, choices come at you thick and fast. You might see some of the first order consequences of those choices immediately. For example, you drink water to satiate your thirst. But the second and third order consequences of these choices are usually less clear, perhaps completely invisible. The causal connection between the choice and the consequence of that choice is unclear in advance. Often it will be unclear to you what the correct choice is because, as in real life, every choice could have both positive and negative consequences. That's what makes it interesting. Let's say you're dehydrated and you've got no water, but you're also poorly equipped, tired, hungry, and it's the black of night. Do you strike out now in search of water, or do you wait for the relative safety of daylight, knowing that you might die from dehydration before you find anything? For the early and mid-game, at least, Project Zomboid's systems drive you out of the comfort zone of your base and into the world, planning, scrounging, sneaking, and chancing. You're constantly making trade-offs, what you need now versus what you might need later. You have to take problems as they come. Choices matter because they have consequences. As in real life, you'll do some stupid things for reasons you don't fully understand and which you might come to regret. Save scumming your way through this experience would clearly undermine it. Project Zomboid provides no load or save options other than those you get when you fire up the game client or quit it, and permadeath is the glue that holds the whole experience together. It forces you to weigh each of your decisions seriously, no matter how big or how small. It's also central to your sense of investment in your character. Knowing that you might lose this character to one stray scratch changes how you approach risky situations. A Z lunging at you out of your blind spot as you enter a room feels visceral in a way that it wouldn't if permadeath wasn't part of the fabric of the game. The feeling of watching a character you put 50 hours into get graphically and permanently devoured by a horde is a rare and special gaming experience. When your game relies so heavily on its systems for the meat of the player experience, there's an unspoken compact between the game and the player that the systems have to be fair, which in this context is in the narrow sense of bug-free. You might feel that running headlong into a horde of zombies as you squeeze through a window is unlucky, but it only violates your sense of fairness if they've all obviously glitched into existence as a result of a bug. From my time with the game, I've run into the occasional bug, but none of them have been game-breaking in this way. Despite being so long in development though, or perhaps because of it, some of Project Zomboid's design decisions are puzzling. Visually speaking, the user interface is a bit of a mess. If the art style of the world, player and zombies is just this side of charming and unique, then the user interface is on the other side of that line. It relies heavily on a bunch of floating windows. They can be repositioned for convenience, which is helpful, but they won't retain their position on the next load, and repositioning alone doesn't change the fact that the overall effect is cluttered. I don't know what the solution is here. On the one hand, I personally came to the view that I could live with it. On the other hand, you get the distinct impression that it could do with a fresh pair of eyes, someone to just come in and say, let's do this from scratch. A bigger problem than the interface though is the inherent tedium of some of the supporting gameplay systems. Something new players will run into almost immediately is that selecting the storage container you want to loot is harder than it should be. You might expect containers closest to you to be automatically selected for looting. Instead, it's some sort of combination of proximity and character direction. In practice, that means that you have to kind of awkwardly pivot towards each container as you pass in order to access the contents. Helpfully, you are able to access any container within a certain radius of your character directly from the looting menu. This allows you to mouse down a list of containers and loot each one in turn. However, in practice the radius is too small. Containers on the other side of just a single room might be inaccessible. A simple fix here would be to double or even triple that radius, allowing you to clear rooms quickly and, more importantly, methodically. Instead of fumbling with your mouse as the list of in-radius containers shifts around on you, you could instead work your way down a stable list. I heard someone once cheekily call this kind of moving interface design a stochastic UI, and I reckon that's spot on. Don't move stuff around on me while I'm trying to interact with it. The problems with inventory management aren't limited to looting though. Too many user interface decisions in this area fail to strike a reasonable balance between realism and enjoyment. Why is it that the contents of bags can only be accessed and manipulated if the bag in question is actually equipped in one of your free hands? Let players access the contents of any bag in their inventory without equipping it in hand. Why is it that you can't assign specific bits of equipment to a specific bag so that you always know where to find it? Equally, you can't assign specific bits of equipment to a specific storage container at your base so that you always know where to find it. Let players designate bags for different purposes: a go bag, a construction bag, medical bag, looting bag, etc. And also specify a list of items that should always automatically be restocked into each bag, assuming they're available, when you're on base. Equally, let players designate base storage for different purposes and have looted supplies automatically deposited into the correct storage when on base. Once you take an item out of a bag to use it, you have to manually return it. This is me drinking water. If you fail to return items to their bag after use, you'll quickly blow through your weight cap and find your character unable to run. Items in a bag that a player uses directly with a right-click option should be automatically returned to the bag they came from once used. In order to use an item or craft something from a crafting resource, you either have to have that item in your possession or it has to be present within a small radius of your character. The fact that it can simply be present within that radius is a good start, and making use of this mechanic is a must. Pile your kindle and firewood near your fire and you'll be able to light, fuel and cook without moving. But in practice, the radius is too small to be helpful and leads to you stockpiling items on the open floor close to where they'll be needed, instead of packing them away in storage where they should be. Why not simply increase the radius within which resources are automatically available to the player for crafting? Perhaps to the size of a single room, which would retain the incentive for players to organise their bases around distinct crafting areas. I understand that the developers are going for realism, but to me the inventory, storage and resource management are perhaps best thought of as support systems, in that they're in the game in service of other more significant gameplay systems, namely the exploration, looting and crafting gameplay loops that are the source of main player engagement. At the beginning of each playthrough, the words "This is how you die" appear on screen. It's an unusual setup. The futility of your struggle is front and centre. That could be a disappointment to some, narratively speaking. Personally, I like that it leans into the artistic vision of the developers. Mechanically, it manifests as the lack of a win condition. Project Zomboid's current endgame sees the player with a well-stocked base confronting an ever-growing horde until the inevitable happens, or you get bored. The extent to which the latter happens will be a function of how self-motivated you are as a player. Yes, there will always be plenty of options for things to do, but if explicit narrative drivers are important to you, then this part of the game is where it will be weakest. The emergent gameplay in Project Zomboid is very good, but some players also enjoy having a handcrafted narrative skeleton on which to hang the meat of their experience. As of the current build 41, there are no scripted missions, no NPCs, and no multiplayer. Earlier builds of the game had all three, in various forms, and the developers do intend to reintroduce them in a future build after ensuring that they get the balancing right. I'm certainly interested in seeing how all that pans out. I'd love to see a series of character-driven stories that push you into unique geographical areas and encounters with zombies, NPCs, and even real players. That sort of narrative potential is clear to see, and the mid to late game is perhaps where the influence of those systems will be felt most. But you shouldn't buy this game expecting that those things will be in it soon, or at all. Project Zomboid has had a long development. It first entered early access on 8th of November 2013. Almost 8 years later, it's still there. Here's a July extract from the developer forum of some of the things that changed in the recent 41.51 update. So zombie pathfinding, rudimentary inventory filtering and hair gel. So we're 9 years in and the devs are still making wholesale changes to fundamental mechanics, but also finding the time to add realistic hair flattening. Yes, I'm cherry picking the examples, but seeing this, it's reasonable to ask whether this project will ever actually be finished. There's plenty of evidence on the face of it to support claims of unfocused scattershot development, and you definitely should know what you're getting into with this before handing over your money. Games in this state are not for everyone. The Project Zomboid experience is sufficiently interesting and unique to stand on its own and to be worth your time. There's also plenty of evidence that this is a passion project for the indie stone, and development certainly remains, if arguably unfocused, then at least regular and committed. The communication, feedback and iteration loop with the community on Steam discussions and Reddit also seems solid. In any event, as at today, August 2021, for me personally, there's enough here that's compelling to warrant your time and money if this sort of thing is up your alley. Even if development were to fall over tomorrow and none of the promised mission, NPC or multiplayer updates ever materialised, I would still rate this as a unique and memorable emergent gameplay experience that I would not want to have missed. I think if Project Zomboid sticks to you, it's because you came for that emergent gameplay and that's what you want to stay for.